Hello folks, this video is for mentoring sessions that I had conducted in the month of November of 2021 on TypeScript for Dataverse. It's a 4-day mentoring session and the agenda for each day is on the playlist in the video's description. The playlist has videos in a sequential order, so do check that out. Now let's get into it. Okay, so today's session is all going to be basic fundamentals of TypeScript, and also we're going to cover some of the Visual Studio Code basics as well. Some of them may be familiar with Visual Studio Code, they have worked with Visual Studio Code, but nonetheless I'm going to cover it so that everyone knows the fundamental of Visual Studio Code as well. Okay, so today this is the only slide in 4-day training that you would see because I wanted to cover some fundamentals of TypeScript before we actually dive into the TypeScript. So let's get started. Okay, so why use TypeScript? What is the reason that we would go with TypeScript over JavaScript? So the first one is strongly typed. Each variable or functions or methods that you define in your code needs a type associated with it. It could be integer, number, or integer, number is same thing, string, or custom objects like custom classes if you define any. Each and every functions or methods or variables needs to have a type defined. Now you could use any as a type, but if you're using any all the time, that means now you're going back to JavaScript. So try to limit any and only use any as a keyword only in special circumstances whenever you're writing TypeScripts. Now that's why TypeScript gives you that strongly typed definition, and this is exactly like what C# has, right? So if you're coming from that C# background, you would see a close resemblance between what you do in C# and what you do in TypeScript. Whereas in JavaScript, everything is variable, right? It could contain integer, it could contain string, it could be mutated from integer to string, it could be done however you want to. So that's only one data type that you have in JavaScript, but in TypeScript you have data types for each and every variables. Now second point is backward compatibility. Now if you're creating your TypeScripts and let's say you were working on TypeScripts and everything works fine, you tested on Chrome browser with the latest Chrome browser installed on your machine, and the code is working absolutely without any issues. But now let's say your client said, hey, I want this code to also be compatible with IE. Now IE technically is not supported anymore, but your TypeScript, you don't have to change your TypeScript. Your TypeScript can be compiled into a code that can be supported on IE as well. And it's just that there's a file called tsconfig, which we're going to look into it today. And that file tsconfig has an attribute called target. That target is what defines in which target it should get compiled. Should it support the latest JavaScript functions, or should it support some backward JavaScript functions as well? So that is what that backward compatibility comes into play. And you can just by changing the config, you can either compile your JavaScript into the latest versions, or you can compile your JavaScript into the previous versions as well. So that's the main benefit of TypeScript, that you don't have to change your code to support a lot of other browsers or other targets, as we call it. Third is it follows the OOPS concept. Now you would say, well, JavaScript also at some level follows the OOPS concept if you do a nice JavaScript code. But in my opinion, if you're coming from C# background, then TypeScript and C# gives you that kind of resemblance again. So it makes things little easier to understand when you're doing TypeScript than when you're doing JavaScript, if you're coming from that C# background. So that's why, in my opinion, I feel like TypeScript is more object oriented, and there is again a debate in community that, well, TypeScript is equal to JavaScript kind of things. But in my opinion, I still feel like it follows a lot of oops concepts. And the fourth is compile time errors. Again, this is one of the benefit of using TypeScript. When you're doing TypeScripts, and if you, let's say your function was returning string, and you have captured that response from that function in an integer type variable. So obviously that's wrong, because your return is string and you're trying to capture it in the integer type variable. So TypeScript at compile time will throw you an error. And if you're using IDEs like Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio, they would prompt you instantaneously, even without compiling, that there's a type mismatch. Some errors are not recognized instantaneously, and you have to do actually compilation of the code to identify them. But again, every error is caught at compile time and not at runtime. And that's what JavaScript does, is right. It doesn't capture the errors at compile time, it captures the error at runtime. So you have to deploy the code and then test your code, and that's when you would identify there's an error, because you're capturing the errors at runtime if you're using only JavaScript. But TypeScript let you capture those errors at compile time. The last point is testing and debugging. Now, as I said, first point is every variable or every method or every function is strongly typed, which means that helps you write better test cases, because you would know exactly what types you are expecting out of those methods, right? So it makes your life easier when you're writing test cases if you're using TypeScripts. Now again, both are not correlated, both are independent. You can still write test cases even if you're using JavaScripts, right? But then I felt that writing test cases using TypeScript is much easier than writing test cases for JavaScript, because again, the same thing, as there is types. Okay, let me put people on mute here. Okay, everyone is muted. Good. So yeah, and where was I? Let me bring this here. Okay, so testing and debugging. So writing test cases makes things little easier. Same goes with debugging. So debugging, when you're writing your TypeScript, it compiles into JavaScript, and that is what is getting deployed to Dataverse. Now if you're just debugging that plain JavaScript, then it might not be readable, or it might add a lot of complexities to the code, so it makes things little difficult to debug. So whenever we are writing TypeScript, make sure that you're compiling with a source map file, and the source map file makes things easier to actually debug a TypeScript file rather than debugging the compiled JavaScript file. We are going to look into debugging at the end of on the fourth day. So we're going to cover debugging as well. So let's moving on. Let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so what is Dataverse DevTools? So I've created this tool with one single purpose or intention, is to simplify writing TypeScripts for Dataverse. Today it has a lot of features that enables you to connect to Dataverse and do a lot of stuff in it, which we are going to cover why to use it in the next slide. But the sole purpose of this Dataverse DevTools is you can work from Visual Studio Code, and you don't have to go to Dataverse, or you don't have to go to Power Platform to do any uploads or do anything with it. Uh, and that's why that was the purpose of creating Dataverse DevTools, is you can work everything from Visual Studio Code itself. And we are going to look into details today of what Dataverse DevTools is. So if you have not installed it yet, then I would recommend you to install it, and I'll show you how to install it in a moment. So the next thing is why to use Dataverse DevTools. Again, it's up to you. You can use it. You can leave it out. It's up to you. But the sole purpose of this was to improve the efficiency and writing code, make things easier, right? So whenever you're doing with TypeScripts, there are a lot of things that you have to prepare. Just like if you are preparing your TypeScript project, you have to do a lot of things, and it's repetitive process. So if you're working on multiple projects, and if you're trying to spin up a new TypeScript project all the time, it's time consuming to set that all up. And that's what I've tried to do, is I've tried to simplify that process. So, and again, connecting to your Dataverse environment gives you that flexibility of identifying what are the entities, what are the web resources, makes you upload the web resources directly from Visual Studio Code. So those are all the benefits that you have when you're using this kind of community built tools. Okay. So some of the community heroes I wanted to identify here is Benedict, Scott, and Oliver. They have written fantastic blogs about how to build your TypeScript, and I'm gonna actually share the links for the blogs. And those are all the links to their blogs. They have explained in detail, and Benedict actually helped me with a lot of this TypeScript project structuring, and Scott as well. So these are the community heroes that I wanted to highlight. They have written a lot of blogs around TypeScript, and also helped me with building the tool as well at some point. So going to the next slide. Yep. Okay, so let's dive into it. Let's see. Now stop the presentations, and then let's actually dive into it. Okay. So first thing we would do is we would go over the basics of Visual Studio Code. Okay. And here we go. Okay. So Visual Studio Code is the tool that I normally recommend. Oh, why did that happen? Here you go. Okay. Visual Studio Code is the tool that I normally go to when I'm dealing with anything related to front end. For back end stuff, and kind of sometimes go to C#, but I'm trying to move away from Visual Studio and then bring everything into Visual Studio Code. It's just very lightweight, and it's also available on the web now, so you don't have to install your IDE, like install Visual Studio Code on each and every machine. Let's say I'm traveling and I received a bug and I want to solve it, right? I can just go on the browser, log into Visual Studio Code with GitHub and everything, and once I log in, I get all my repositories then and there itself. I don't have to install Visual Studio Code, so I can do it on any machine that I have access to. I don't have to carry my laptop anymore. So those are kind of some benefits of using Visual Studio Code if you're into it. So again, basics of Visual Studio Code, we are going to start with that. This is called activity bar. You can move the activity bar to the right, or you can keep it to the left, which is the default one. It's up to you, your preference. I like to keep it to the left. Activity bars is where you would see a lot of these options First is called Explorer, which lets you explore the folder that you have opened. So if you open any folder, so you can actually open any folder. You don't have to have a solution file like how you do it in Visual Studio. You need to have a solution file to open it in Visual Studio. You don't need that solution file. You can just create folders, put everything inside a folder, or you can even create a new folder here called test demo, yes, which we're going to use this at later point of time. I can go in here, I can say select folder, and as soon as I say select folder, yeah, okay, and there you go. So it loaded with that folder structure. Now there's nothing in it, so it doesn't show me anything. So going back to this one, okay, then this is the search bar or search function. Now search function is pretty great in Visual Studio Code. You can actually search for anything, like say form context. You can see that form context, it identified in several places and just shows me over here. Identified in map file, it identified in JS file, it identified in TypeScript file. We can also do regular expressions, and regular expressions can be used in both like find as well as replace. So those are some of the nifty features of Visual Studio Code. Then is the Git repository. If you have connected to your Git, then all of the functions like creating branch or cloning branch, pushing, publishing branch, publishing your committing your changes, all those kind of things, or syncing or pulling down from your Git, all those kind of things can be done over here. This is where you can run and debug. So it's kind of like a play button that you get in Visual Studio. Similar thing is here, but you can actually there are in front end, there are so many variety of things that you can do. If you're working with Angular, there's a different commands that you have to run. And if you're running Node.js project, and there's a different commands that you have to run to debug or to test, those kind of things. So it makes things easier to just keep this open-ended, and that's what they have done in VS Code. They have kept this open-ended, so you can configure your own run and debug commands in here. Now when you are working with Dataverse, you don't actually need to do anything with this. What we would be using instead is we would be using Fiddler to do the debugging of the TypeScript file, which we would be looking on day 4, right? So right now, just good to know. This is pretty useful when you're using PCF controls. Like if you're doing any PCF control thing, then that's when this would come handy. Then are the extensions. Extensions is where you can extend the basic VS Code functionality and then just improve it. And I have used a lot of extensions, which I'll actually recommend some of them for you to install in a moment here. So extensions, we would come back to this again. Then here you can see GitHub. Now this is not part of VS Code by default, or neither is Azure or GitHub Actions or even Dataverse DevTools. These are all icons that appear because I have installed the extensions. So if you have installed GitHub extensions, it will show up here. If you have installed Azure, it will show up here. So that's what happens. So extensibility of VS Code is pretty great. So some of the extensions that I would recommend you to install is Better Comments. What it does is it allows you to write comments, and then it in certain way. So if you do asterisk, then it just highlights it in green. If you do exclamatory mark, it will highlight it in red. Question, it will highlight it in blue, and to-dos will be highlighted in orange. You can change the colors as well if you want to, but it just gives you that quick glance on where your comments are and what those comments actually mean. Then is Dataverse DevTools, obviously, right? We are going to heavily use this throughout 4-day training, and you can install it, and you'll see a lot of features already listed down here. We are going to go through those features today as well. So that's another tool. Then is error lens. Error lens actually shows you error on that line itself. You get the error list separately in the debug console, but when you see the error on that line instantaneously, it helps you fix those errors, right? So it is really handy. Then is ESLint. This is the linter tool that I prefer using, and what it does is it has this rules that it runs your JavaScript or TypeScript. It works with TypeScript as well, and it runs those rules and then see if your code is matching those rules. And if it doesn't match those rules, then it will prompt you either with warning or errors. Sometimes you can say that do not allow any, or you're checking for certain rules, and it will just check for those rules, and if you said don't even allow this, it would throw an error, compilation error, so you cannot proceed further. So those are kind of like if you want to make your code reviews much cleaner, then using this kind of tools helps you make sure that you don't have to spend a lot of time reviewing your code. Then is GitLens. What GitLens does is if you have connected to your Git, then it prompts you with this blame. So you can say this line was who edited it, when was it edited, and what was the commit, right? So it gives you like insights into the commits, and it gives you the latest one. So this is like, this was the latest commit that happened 4 years ago by me. That's just an example. It also gives you like in Visual Studio 2019 or 2022, whichever you're using, it gives you this nice insights into who edited it, when was it edited, and who are the authors, those kind of things. Similarly, if you're by default, VS Code doesn't give you that, but if you installed Git Lenses, it gives you that kind of functionality as well. Then is Indent Rainbow. Indent Rainbow, I like it because whenever you're indenting anything, it just highlights those portions with a different color. So like here, it's not pretty visible in here, but you can change the colors, and that's what I've done. And you'll see when we dive into the code, you'll see how my indentations are colored differently. If you're working with markdown files, I love markdown all-in-one. It lets me write markdown files in a nice fashion, and it also gives me an ability to view the markdown files as well. And then PCF Builder is the other one, and there you go, PCF Builder. If you're working with PCF, it's not loading. Okay, there you go. So if you're working with PCF, if you're building code components, then this is another extension available for you. Makes things a little easier. You can actually have a nice play mode in it, which lets you play the PCF code component inside of VS Code without running it in the browser. So that's nice feature of it. Prettier is the other one. This is again, it helps you reduce the code review processes, and so that every developer would have the same format of the code. Now Prettier, actually whenever I'm using Prettier, I do two settings to VS Code. So I'm going to show you those two settings as well. So you go to preference and you go to settings, and inside the settings you can search for save, and you'll see that format on save is switched on. What it does is every time you write a code and you save it, it will try to format the code with the default formatter that is available on the in VS Code. Now because I've installed Prettier, it normally becomes your default code formatter tool. But what happens is, now if I'm working on some repository or someone else's, because I work for community, right? So I also work for improving someone else's code, and they might have different standards in which might not work with what I have set for my Prettier definitions. So to avoid those kind of unnecessary formatting of the code whenever not needed, I also use one more setting that is on the prettier. Okay, and then in the prettier, you scroll down and you see that this is checked, which says require config. What it does is it would only format the code whenever a prettier config file is present in the explorer bar. So in this explorer bar, whenever there's a prettier config file present, only then it will format the code. Otherwise it will not format the code. So it just makes things a little easier. And again, using this config file lets you have the ability to have different formatting settings for each project. So in some project you could use tab as the indentation. In some projects you can have 4 spaces as indentation, and in some project you can have 2 spaces as indentation. So you can manage those indentation or whatever your formatting rules are in those projects using this config file. We're going to look into it in details as well. So before I move on, let's see if I have any questions to answer. Yeah, that's a good idea, Jason. You can share it with everyone if you have taken the screenshot, or I can send the screenshot as well of all the extensions that I have on my machine. Okay, so next thing that we are going to look into is Dataverse DevTools. Now, Dataverse DevTools is a new extension, so I'm still improving the extensions, and I'm also accepting any pull request that you find is helpful. Do the code edits, send in the pull request, and I'll accept it. Yeah. So some of the things that we wanna keep in mind is Dataverse DevTools. You need to connect to an instance for it to be fully functional. You can do a lot of things without even connecting to it, but like using just TypeScript thing, like you can create TypeScript project and whatnot, but to upload, to download, all those kind of things between Dataverse, you need to have a connection. Now I can create a connection. So let me create a connection here. So you can create a connection, let's say, and then this asks you to create a connection using a Dataverse environment URL. I provided URL. Then it gives you option, either you want to provide Microsoft login prompt or username and password, right? So I click on Microsoft login prompt. It tells me to provide a friendly name. So I'll say demo TS MSFT login. Then it asks me whether it is a dev, QA, UAT, what kind of a type it is. Default is dev. So I select dev. It goes and authenticates my account. And now it says you're signed in, and now you can close this page. Close this page. I come in here and I see that demo TS MSFT login is logged in. Now as soon as I log in, it goes and pulls all the entities that are available in my instance. It also goes and pulls in all the web resources that are unmanaged web resources, right? Because there are like hundreds of web resources in any Dataverse environments, but it just pulls the only one that are unmanaged so that you have the edit rights to it. And now what you could do is you can actually sometimes let's say you want to know the details about this connection because you forgot. So you can do a right click and then say show connection details, and it will give you the environment URL. It will give you what is the login type been used. If you're using Microsoft login prompt, there is no username and there is no password, but you have access token and refresh token showing up here. But you can use this access tokens and refresh tokens to actually do some postman queries if you want to. It would still work because it's already authenticated. And if you use username and password, so show connection details, it would actually show the login type as username and password, and then actually show you the username that you are using, and access token and refresh token will be blank at that time. Okay. Moving on to entities section. Entities section, you can do the same thing. You can right click the entity and then say show entity details, and it will show you if the SLA is enabled, what type of entity it is. It will give you the object type code, primary ID attribute, and primary name attribute, and then also entity set name. Now entity set name is sometimes good to have if you're doing any web API calls, and also gives you list of attributes which you may not need it. That's up to you, right? But it just gives you all the list of attributes. Right now I know it lacks the feature of search, which is something on my list to add the search capability in here. So that's for the entity details. You can also generate entity typings, and this is really great because when you're, as I said, like everything needs to be defined. So if you're using entity types or typings for the entities, it becomes kind of early bound thing, and you can use it in the code, which we are going to look into today probably. And that just helps you make sure that your code is correctly typed. Okay, and this is actually integrated with XRM types as well. So if you have not heard of XRM types, I'm going to demo that to you as well in today's session. Now moving on, we have web resources. And in web resources, again, same thing, only CSS, HTML, TypeScripts are shown here. You can link these web resources in your local repository and whatnot. We are going to look into that as well. Now, one thing I forgot, you can actually filter the entities, because now you can see there's so many entities. Now, let's say if I'm only going to work on one single solution, I can filter the entities based on the solution. Let's say I'm going to just filter whatever is in the demo. And then that's it. These are all the entities that are in the demo that show up. I can remove the filter. Same thing happens here as well in the web resources. I can filter the web resources for that particular solution itself. Then is the smart match in the web resources. So if you click on smart match, what it does is it goes and looks up all the TypeScript web resources, so JavaScript web resources, and goes and looks in the local file and checks whether you have the same name or path. It does some logic to identify whether I am able to find a match or not. So in this case, I don't actually have a match, but I'll come back to this later again to see how that match works. Okay. Now moving on to So here, as you can see, I've already initialized the TypeScript project, but let's say I've opened up a new empty folder. Now in this empty folder, I'm going to initialize my TypeScript project. I just right click and then say create Dataverse TypeScript project. It also has a shortcut key called Control D, Control T. Okay, so once you click it, now there are two options. TypeScript only means vanilla TypeScript project. It would not have any Webpack configurations installed in it. And then the other one is Webpack. What does it means is it would install all the TypeScript format, but it would also add Webpack configurations to it as well. Okay, so we can choose TypeScript just to show how that differentiates. So in this, you would see that it's doing this npm install as well, right? So all those details are already loaded for you. You have the folder structure. So there's a source folder, there's a web resource folder, and then there is this prettier JSON, ESLint installed to you, and then tsconfig. Now tsconfig is however we want it to be. Tsconfig for TypeScript I've kept it as ES5. You can go up to ES6 if you want to. But these are all the configuration that I'm providing out of the box, like through tool. Okay. And then what you could do is you could go to source and then right click source and then say add Dataverse TypeScript file. When you do that, it will ask for the name. So let's say we do demo. Yeah. So now it added the TypeScript file called demo. You can see it here, and it has a snippet for you. It gives you what you need to do with it, how the form context would be, and things like that. Right now, one thing I have to do is to go, and so package.json is where your scripts are built in, and this script show up in the npm script over here. So I can just go in and run this npm script, and then it would compile and generate the JavaScript file for us. Let's see. Okay, so it compiled, no errors. If I expand this, I should see the demo.js file created for us, right? Now this is plain TypeScript format that we have used. We have not used Webpacks in here. Okay. Now ESLint is the config file that I told you about. It has a lot of this settings, a lot of this configurations built into it, right? And as you can see, every time if you want to set this up, you have to remember what was the rules that was set up. You have to probably even copy this config from somewhere else as well. So now with this project, you're getting all those settings built in. It also does this ignore patterns, like out directory should be ignored, distribute directory should be ignored, all the typing files should be ignored, web resource folder should be ignored, node modules should be ignored. So those kind of things, like it won't go and check for node modules, it won't go and check for what's JavaScript compiled of, it won't throw in errors for those kind of things. And then again, prettier is the next one. Prettier is it's set with tab width as 4. It is set. These are all the settings that you can absolutely change them, right? When you are changing them, it actually gives you this kind of things like true, false. So if I'm setting semicolon to false, then if you miss a semicolon when writing TypeScript, it won't prompt you for it. It won't format for you automatically. ESLint will throw an error probably, but prettier, what it does is if you forget a semicolon, it will go and add that semicolon for you, so you don't have to worry about it. So I'll always like to keep it true. So those kind of things in here. You can find all these configuration settings on, like if you just search prettier config, you'll get it. If you search for ESLint config, you'll get it. Same is for package.json. Package.json has very basic minimum things. Most of them are dev dependencies, again, because we are not creating Node.js application. We are creating something that is going to be deployed. It's not going to be deployed as a Node.js solution to Dataverse. It's going to be deployed as an individual JavaScript file. So all the dependencies that you would install has to be dev dependencies. Probably you would have some dependencies that might not be dev dependencies, but if you have those, then Webpack or TS compiler will take care into installing that into the JavaScript file itself. Then last is tsconfig. Tsconfig, as I said, some of them are compiled into ES6, some of them are compiled into ES5. Again, if you go in here, you'd see these are all the options available for you. Okay. Now coming back to my VS Code basics. Okay. So this is what the structure would look like if you went with Webpack config instead. So in the Webpack config, you get this same thing, source, web resources, but the difference is you would have this three files in here, which are called Webpack config dev. This is the common one, and then this is the production one. Okay. Package.json would now not have those. So let me just open up another Visual Studio Code with that folder so we can compare the two files. So going to package.json. So in package.json, you saw this is my script section in my package.json, and build is just calling tsc. Now tsc is the default command for compiling TypeScript project, right? That's what is the default. But in my package.json, I have changed it to Webpack, and so now ts compiler is not the default compiler. Webpack is the compiling machine. So what Webpack does is it goes and compiles the packages or that JavaScript files for you. And what it does is it goes through this config file. If you go to config file, you would have to make sure that you have an entry point in here. Okay. Now you can have multiple entry points, and those entry points are what gets generated into these JavaScript files. So you would see that demo1. So now we have demo1.js. If I change this to say something else, TypeScript test, right? I save it and then I compile this. It's compiling. You can see the progress over here, and then it generated the TypeScript test.js as the file. Now let me close this. Now our TypeScript file name was demo1.ts, but why did it generate TypeScript test.js? The reason is this entry point. So this name here defines what that JavaScript file will be named. Okay, and that's what this output defines. And output also says put the source maps in the map folder. So this maps folder is where the map files will be. And then this is the library. Now library tells you what the namespace of that files would be. So if I go to JavaScript file, this is, you would see that the exported is mav, because mav is my namespace. So if I have to use this JavaScript in my on my Dataverse, then I cannot just use onload. I have to use mav. So if I go to the JavaScript file again, I have to use mav, because that's a namespace, dot onload. Okay, because that is what is getting exported. Now here, if I go now, this is one of the cool thing that I added to the tool is when you're adding a TypeScript file using this add Dataverse TypeScript file button, and let's say you want to do ts demo, right? That file will have the snippet, the code snippet, but if you go to Webpack config, it automatically adds that thing, that entry point for you. So you don't have to worry about what goes in the entry point, because the Dataverse DevTools, whenever you add that through Dataverse DevTools, it's taking care for you. So you just have to worry about compiling and writing code in it. So in TS demo, I used class, right? In Webpack config, I've provided the namespace mav, and that's what it is. So if I have to use this on my let's say in my JavaScript file, or when I'm associating an event on a form, then how I would use it is mav dot ts demo. Now remember, everything is case sensitive, right? And then on load. This is how I'm going to use my function, okay, when I'm associating an event on the form. Now when you're compiling, so let's go back here and let's delete everything. Okay, let's go in here, delete everything. Okay, so everything is deleted. There's nothing in here except the node modules because it takes time to delete it. I'll go and create a Dataverse TypeScript project, and this time I'll pick Webpack, and let's see what the navigation is for Webpack. So once I'm going with the Webpack, it asks me for the namespace. Okay, and here I can do Dataverse DB as my namespace, and now it will go and install all this things for me. In the meantime, I can go and add a Dataverse TypeScript file here. I can say demo. Yeah. So it added the demo file, and it would go and add that in my Webpack as the entry point as well. Okay. While it's installing all the node modules, in the meantime, I'll go and connect to my instance. So this is a quick connect button over here. What it's doing is going and getting the metadata, entity metadata files, and also it will go and get the web resources as well. So let's give it a minute. In the meantime, let me check if there are any questions. Okay, well, it's connected now, and I'll get back to the questions in a moment. So you can see that it's connected in here, right? Now the cool thing is it remembers. So I am in this folder, in demo ts folder, and I've connected to this instance. It remembers which connection you have used for which folder. So if I close this folder and reopen this folder, it will connect to that instance automatically behind the scenes. So let's see how that works. So I'm going to close it, and I'm going to open the folder again. Demo.ts. Oh, sorry, demo.ts. That's it, right? And actually it's connecting in the background. It takes a little bit time because it's doing the authentication, and activation of extension is also part of it. But you can see that now it shows connected to, and it's already connected for you. If you go to Dataverse DevTools over here, entity is already preloaded for you, web resources are already preloaded for you, right? So that folder, remembering the connections on that folder makes things easier, because now you don't have to every time go and connect, right? Cool. So yeah, that's it. And then smart match. So now I have used this demo.ts folder in here, and you can see that there's a demo.js in here as well. So what it would do is, even though the path is not matching, it would try to match that. It should have, but somehow it didn't. Okay, maybe I have to use something else. Demo.js. Oh, I didn't compile it, I guess. That's why I did not compile this this project. So let me compile it, and it will generate the JavaScript file locally. Okay, so it generated demo.js. And if I go in here and I do smart match, there you go. So what it did is it looked on the server, it found a demo.js as a local file name. This is a server path, but then it found a demo.js in my local as well. So it did a match, and then that match confidence it's saying is at 60%. Sometimes if it has the right path and right name, then it will do a match of 100% as well. And you can actually just go and quickly link it, and that's how that's linked, right? So once you linked it, if you go to Dataverse DevTools, it shows this is linked, and you can just upload this file from here, or you can even upload it from here. Right click and then upload web resource. Okay. So yeah, that's all I had for today. We have some time for going over the questions. So let me go over the questions that are in the chat first, and then we'll open up the mic. So first question is from Deepak, and his question is, does this work for on-prem too? It does not work for on-prem because the connection that we have built right now into the tool that only works with online. So probably we'll look into how does this work with on-prem at some point, but right now it doesn't. Lee has posted a screenshot where it says it needs admin approval, which is true. So if you're using connections and if you are authenticating using Microsoft login, then your admin needs to provide approval for this Dataverse DevTools. And we are also thinking of adding one more functionality in here where you can create your own app registration in Azure and then provide that for the authentication as well. Now that is something that we are still working on. So if you find Microsoft login as an issue, then I would ask you to use username and password temporarily, and then we'll add more features in the connections. Then the question is from Fariz. I get issue when I create my TS project with Webpack option. Okay, and the screenshot is, let me bring it over here. This is the screenshot. Okay. This actually happens sometimes. So what you have to do is you just have to add a source file in it. Because it's missing a source file, it is empty. So you can actually add a source file and then just do a refresh, and that tsconfig error should go away. Or if you can just reopen the folder, it should go away. It's just a temporary thing. It's trying to find what's in source file, but it doesn't find anything. That's why it prompts you for an error. And that is something that I cannot handle in the project. It's what, I don't want to add files into the source folder, right? So that's why you get that issue. Lee's question is, will username and password work without admin approval? Yes, absolutely. Username and password will work without admin approval. Another question is from Bestain, and his question is, what was again the shortcut for creating new project? It's Control D, Control T, and you can see it over here as well. Control D, Control T. Okay. Any other questions from anyone? So let me go back to presentation. So any questions from anyone? You are welcome to open the mic and ask the questions if you don't want to type it in the chat. Cool. Yeah, again, tomorrow's agenda would be a deeper dive into TypeScripts. Today was just an overview. So tomorrow we are actually going to go hands-on. So if you want to get your hands-on practice, I recommend you to install the extension, because that is what we would be heavily using from tomorrow. Okay.